In this lesson, you will learn that conflict between Great Britain and the American colonies grew over issues of taxation, representation, and liberty. Please pause and read the objectives. By 1763, right after the French and Indian War, tensions between Britain and one colony, Massachusetts, had already been increasing. During the French and Indian War, the British had cracked down on colonial smuggling. In 1761, the royal governor of Massachusetts authorized the use of writs of assistance, which allowed British customs officials to search any ship or building. Because many merchants worked out of their residences, the writs enabled officials to search colonial homes. The merchants of Boston were outraged. After the war, the British government stationed 10,000 troops in its territories to control the Native American and former French subjects. Although this army was meant to protect the colonists viewed it as a standing army that might turn against them. Maintaining troops in North America was an added expense on an already strained British budget. Britain had borrowed so much money during the war that it nearly doubled its national debt. Hoping to lower the debt, King George III chose a financial expert, George Grenville, shown here, to serve as Prime Minister in 1763. Grenville soon angered merchants throughout the colonies. He began to suspect that the colonists were smuggling goods into the country. In 1764, he prompted Parliament to enact a law known as the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act did three things. It halved the duty, or tax, on farm-made molasses in the hopes that the colonists would pay a lower tax rather than risk arrest by smuggling. It placed duties on certain imports. Most important, it strengthened the enforcement of the law, allowing prosecutors to try smuggling cases in a vice admiralty court rather than in a more sympathetic colonial court. By the end of 1764, the colonies in Great Britain were disagreeing more and more about how the colonies should be taxed and governed. These feelings of dissatisfaction soon would swell into outright rebellion. The seeds of increased tension were sown in March 1765 when Parliament, persuaded by Prime Minister George Grenville, passed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for every legal document, license, newspaper, pamphlet, and almanac, and imposed special stamp duties on packages of playing cards and dice. When word of the Stamp Act reached the colonies in May of 1765, the colonists united in their defiance. Boston shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers organized a secret resistance group called the Sons of Liberty. By the end of the summer, the Sons of Liberty were harassing customs workers, stamp agents, and sometimes royal governors. Facing mob threats and demonstrations, stamp agents all over the colonies resigned. During 1765 and early 1766, the individual colonial assemblies confronted the Stamp Act measure. Virginia's lower house adopted several resolutions that stated that Virginians could be taxed only by the Virginia Assembly, that is, only by their own representatives. Other assemblies passed similar resolutions. The colonial assemblies also made a strong collective protest. In October of 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York City. This Stamp Act Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which stated that Parliament lacked the power to impose taxes on the colonies because the colonies were not represented in Parliament. For the first time, the separate colonies began to act as one. Merchants in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia agreed not to import goods manufactured in Britain until the Stamp Act was repealed. They expected that British merchants would force Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. The widespread boycott worked. In March of 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but on the same day, to make its power clear, Parliament issued the Declaratory Act. This act asserted Parliament's full right to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. Within a year after Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, Charles Townshend, the leading government minister at the time, impetuously decided on a new method of gaining revenue from the American colonies. His proposed revenue laws, passed by Parliament in 1767, became known as the Townshend Acts. Unlike the Stamp Act, which was a direct tax, these were indirect taxes, or duties levied on imported materials, such as glass, lead, paint, and paper, as they came into the colonies from Britain. The acts imposed a 3-penny tax on tea, the most popular drink in the colonies. The colonists reacted with rage and well-organized resistance. Educated Americans spoke out against the Townshend Acts for protesting taxation without representation. Conflict intensified in June 1768. British agents in Boston seized the Liberty, a ship belonging to a local merchant named John Hancock. The customs inspector claimed that Hancock had smuggled in a shipment of wine from Spain and had failed to pay the customs taxes. The seizure triggered riots against customs agents. In response, the British stationed 2,000 redcoats, or British soldiers, so named for the red jackets they wore, in Boston. The presence of British soldiers in Boston streets charged the air with hostility. One sore point was the competition for jobs between colonists and poorly paid soldiers who looked for extra work in local shipyards during off-duty hours. On the cold afternoon of March 5, 1770, a fistfight broke out over jobs. That evening a mob gathered in front of the customs house and taunted the guards. When Crispus Attucks and several dockhands appeared on the scene, an armed clash erupted, leaving Attucks and 4 others dead in the snow. Instantly, Samuel Adams and other colonial agitators labeled the confrontation the Boston Massacre, thus presenting it as a British attack on defenseless citizens. Despite strong feelings on both sides, the political atmosphere relaxed somewhat during the next 2 years until 1772, when a group of Rhode Island colonists attacked a British customs schooner that patrolled the coast for smugglers. After the ship accidentally ran aground near Providence, the colonists boarded the vessel and burned it to the waterline. In response, King George named a special commission to seek out the suspects and bring them to England for trial. The plan to haul Americans to England for trial ignited widespread alarm. The assemblies of Massachusetts and Virginia set up committees of correspondence to communicate with other colonies about this and other threats to American liberties. By 1774, such committees formed a buzzing communication network linking leaders in nearly all the colonies. The British East India Company, which held an official monopoly on tea imports, had been hit hard by the colonial boycotts. With its warehouses bulging with 17 million pounds of tea, the company was nearing bankruptcy. To save it, Parliament devised the Tea Act, which granted the company the right to sell tea to the colonies free of the taxes that colonial tea sellers had to pay. This action would cut colonial merchants out of the tea trade because the East India Company could sell its tea directly to consumers for less. Parliament hoped the American colonists would simply buy the cheaper tea. Instead, they protested violently. On the moonlit evening of December 16, 1773, a large group of Boston rebels disguised themselves as Native Americans and proceeded to take action against 3 British tea ships anchored in the harbor. In this incident, known as the Boston Tea Party, the Indians dumped 18,000 pounds of the East India Company's tea into the waters of Boston Harbor. King George III was infuriated by this organized destruction of British property, and he pressed Parliament to act. In 1774, Parliament responded by passing a series of measures that colonists called the Intolerable Acts. One law shut down Boston Harbor because the colonists had refused to pay for the damaged tea. Another, the Quartering Act, authorized British commanders to house soldiers in vacant private homes and other buildings. In addition to these measures, General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America, was appointed the new governor of Massachusetts. To keep the peace, he placed Boston under martial law, a rule imposed by military forces. The committees of correspondence quickly moved into action and assembled the First Continental Congress. In September 1774, 56 delegates met in Philadelphia and drew up a declaration of colonial rights. They defended the colony's right to run their own affairs. They supported the protests in Massachusetts and stated that if the British used force against the colonies should fight back. They also agreed to reconvene in May 1775 if their demands weren't met. In May of 1775, colonial leaders convened a second Continental Congress in Philadelphia to debate their next move. Beyond their meeting hall, however, events continue moving quickly, as Minutemen and British soldiers clashed in a bloody battle outside Boston, and an increasingly furious King George readied his country for war. The loyalties that divided colonists sparked endless debates at the Second Continental Congress. John Adams of Massachusetts suggested a sweeping, radical plan, that each colony set up its own government, and that the Congress declare the colonies independent. Furthermore, he argued, Congress should consider the militiamen besieging Boston to be the Continental Army and name a general to lead them. Congress agreed to recognize them as the Continental Army and appointed as its commander a 43-year-old veteran of the French and Indian War, George Washington. The Congress, acting like an independent government, also authorized the printing of paper money to pay the troops and organized a committee to deal with foreign nations. By July, the Second Continental Congress was readying the colonies for war while still hoping for peace. Most of the delegates, like most colonists, felt deep loyalty to George III and blamed the bloodshed on the king's ministers. On July 8, 1775, the Congress sent the king the so-called Olive Branch Petition, urging a return to the former harmony between Britain and the colonies. King George flatly rejected the petition. Furthermore, he issued a proclamation stating that the colonies were in rebellion and urged Parliament to order a naval blockade of the American coast. By early summer 1776, events pushed the wavering Continental Congress toward a decision. North Carolina had declared itself independent, and a majority of Virginians told their delegates that they favored independence. At last, the Congress urged each colony to form its own government. On June 7th, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee moved that these united colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states. While talks on this fateful motion were underway, the Congress appointed a committee to prepare a formal declaration explaining the reasons for the colony's actions. Virginia lawyer Thomas Jefferson, known for his broad knowledge and skillfully crafted prose, was chosen to express the committee's points. Jefferson's masterful Declaration of Independence drew on the concepts of English philosopher John Locke, who maintained that the people enjoy natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson described these rights as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On July 2, 1776, the delegates voted unanimously that the American colonies were free, and on July 4, 1776, they adopted the Declaration of Independence. Americans now faced a difficult, bitter choice: revolution or loyalty to the crown. The issue divided communities, friends, and even families throughout the colonies.